You've lost a friend, you've lost a parent, you've lost a sibling, you've lost a child. They're not actually trusting God with what happened. My life would have been better. God didn't care enough to protect my loved one. The first truth I help my patients understand is that grief is normal. Death is an intrusion. Death is abnormal.
Yes.
God created human beings to live eternally in Eden. It was never his intention for them to suffer and die. So the fact that we grieve when someone is passed is normal. Welcome to Design for More, sponsored by Come and Reason Ministries and Honey Lake Clinic. I'm Dr. Tim Jennings, and I'm joined today by Danielle Rome, one of our therapists, and James Johnson, our chief of chaplains. And today, we're going to be talking about grief and grief resolution. And this is, something that sadly, in this world of sin in which we live, if you live long enough, everybody has to deal with grief in some form or fashion. Who wants to start? But what are the obstacles and what are the solutions you've seen for our patients? And here at the clinic, many of them are dealing with grief.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of people that come in are struggling with, maybe it's something recent, a significant loss. A lot of the times when we think of grief, we think of death, but grief can apply to other things as well.
Like what?
Like a very significant life change that is maybe perceived
like what?
As a strong loss.
No, you're right. I just want to be very clear. So we all know that grief can be the death of a family member or a loved one. Okay, but the other griefs.
Yeah, the loss of a long-term relationship or a job. Maybe it can be a significant financial loss. Quite a variety of things. But from what I've seen, it's perceived as something that significantly negatively long-term will impact their life, and that can be hard for people to process and make sense of.
Thoughts about grief or what grief is? Or
like she said, it's the loss of something that is connected to our identity and what we view as important in our life and the world. But one of the things that ends up becoming a point of contention, in my experience, at least from the spiritual side of the house, is positive things that cause that loss that we don't take time to grieve, like a child growing up, doing a good job. We've as parents, we've raised them well. They're launched into the world, and now we have empty nest.
Okay, so grief can come from a positive advancement that simultaneously is a loss.
That's right.
So as you say that, I think it's a great example. How about, have you ever known anybody grieve after graduation?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, the post-PhD blues is a thing.
Or I was thinking, I saw, now for me it wasn't the case, but I saw some of my classmates from high school when we graduated, some of them were crying. Mm-hmm. They were, and they were sad, and there was loss going on because there were certain, and it's true that those relationships were never the same after that high school experience ends. Isn't that true?
Yeah, right. Absolutely.
But would we want to stay in high school forever? I hope not.
Some people would.
Not.
Yeah. But yeah, there's this idea. So grief, I think, is, as you're saying, the loss of something that has been, how did you say, important to us, where our heart is attached to?
Absolutely. It's connected to our identity and the way we view our life. Mm-hmm. Who am I
something
without
we cherish, something that gives us a sense of well-being or security. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It may not be healthy.
Oh, yeah.
In fact, the Bible talks about circumcision of the heart by the Holy Spirit, cutting away from our heart things that we've become attached to that aren't necessarily healthy. Do you think if somebody is cutting away unhealthy things, that could sometimes entail grief too?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Even if it's being led by the Holy Spirit?
Yes.
We might want to come back on that. That just popped into my mind. But let's stay with, I think, what would be maybe the more typical thing, and that is somebody's lost something, a loved one, a pet.
Absolutely.
That's very common, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Or something else important to them.
House burns down.
Okay. Mm-hmm. I've seen people grieve at the loss of ability.
Mm-hmm. Autonomy, absolutely.
Or the loss of innocence. And I don't mean because they're a victim. I mean they've come to understand something they didn't understand, that they were kind of in an innocent way of seeing things. and now they've seen something, and they grieve the previous perspectives. So anyway, how do we help our patients with grief when they're grieving? Let's take the I think the central, most common one that everybody's going to deal with. You've lost a loved one.
Yes.
You've lost a friend. You've lost a parent. You've lost a sibling. You've lost a child.
Yeah.
How do we help them deal with that?
I think a big part of it is this large, huge weight of emotions that can seem to come in waves. So, there's people talk about the stages of grief, and that's not entirely the most accurate of the representation of the process. But I love the model of that there are these waves that come. And so sometimes people that come here are because they're overwhelmed by that first wave of sadness or inability to really reconcile or make sense of what happened. Sometimes people come because they never were really able to let go, or they weren't able to actually process those waves, and so they feel stuck in this past loss, and so sometimes then they come to us for help as well. But a lot of that is allowing those emotions to come and be processed, but also knowing when to move forward and when to let go. So I love what's called the dual process model, where you're kind of oscillating between more loss-oriented, so processing what was lost or who you lost, but then also going towards restoration-oriented processes. So focusing on what does this new life look like now without this person? So sometimes that's learning new tasks, learning new skills, relearning how to interact with people, sometimes on your own if you're used to going places with your spouse, things like that. But oscillating between this, processing the past, but also moving forward into the future. And both can be difficult, and both carry stress and weight, but it's allowing yourself to oscillate naturally, progressively towards moving forward.
What have you found helpful?
Well, I think one of the greatest things is to help people, like you said, just to address it. She said something really powerful. When people come here, they finally have the space and the tools to deal with it. As a hospital chaplain, one of the things that I've been often frustrated at, and part of it is just the business of healthcare, is a patient passes away. We have a few seconds, maybe a minute, that we let the moment exist, and then they've covered the body, they've transferred them to the morgue. By the end of the day, it's at a funeral home. Usually in the next few days to a week, they've been buried or cremated, and it's over. Like, our society, at least here in the United States, does not do a good job of making that space for people to grieve, and so they often either don't feel like they can, or they're not equipped with how to do it. And then there's the problem of we have this weird discomfort in our culture that after the funeral, after whatever, people kind of just disappear. And that person is left on their own without a community, without the tools. And so, that's the big problem. And I think one of the greatest things we can do is we validate and affirm the grief experience. And like Danielle said, we give them those tools to help them recognize that this is a process.
So I like what you said there. In my practice in dealing with lots of grief over the years, healing always starts with the truth.
Yes.
As what you're saying.
Yes.
And the first truth I help my patients understand is that grief is normal.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Death is an intrusion. Death is abnormal.
Yes.
God created human beings to live eternally in Eden. It was never his intention for them to suffer and die. So death is an intrusion, and it's right or righteous for us to not like it. And when it happens to someone close to us, that we don't enjoy that we actually feel loss related to that. So the fact that we grieve when someone is passed is normal.
Yes.
But another truth, so first off, I tell them it's normal. Second truth I tell them, though, is grief sucks.
Yeah.
And that's very, I can't tell you how many times when I say that, grief's like, the shoulder, finally. Yes, it does. It sucks.
Yeah.
And because it sucks, because it's miserable, because it's horrible, the natural response, almost always, in fact, I don't know that I've ever seen one that didn't, is to attempt to avoid it.
Yes.
And that's why, one of the stages is denial.
Yeah.
I've never really seen someone cognitively deny somebody's died. They factually know the truth.
Yep.
So they don't actually, I've never seen someone go into a delusion where they're believing the loved one's still alive and living in the home with them. I've never seen that. So it's not denial of the fact that happened. It's denial of the experience of it, and deny through, no, I'm not gonna face this. I'm not gonna deal with it. It's too painful. It's too much. And so they avoid by getting into busyness or entertainment or substances or something to avoid the misery. And so truth, it hurts, sucks, and that's a normal experience because this is an intruder. But then the truth, I tell them also, is you can't go around it, you can't go under it, you can't go over it, you can only go through it.
Yep.
And the waves is a great one. I love the waves. I use the waves as well.
Yep.
And I use the analogy. I said, have you ever been to the beach?
Yep.
And as waves are coming in, if you try to run from the wave and it catches you from behind, what happens? It knocks you down. But if you see the wave coming and you lean into it, you get soaked, but you stay on your feet. There is no avoiding this because no matter where you run, you take you with you. And you will always have this grief until you lean into it and resolve it.
Yeah.
And so step one, stop running, stand your ground.
Yeah.
Step one. It's just very basic truth. What it is, it sucks, it's not going to feel good. Step one, stop running and stand your ground. And then I use the wave example even more. I point out with waves, the grief comes in waves, just like you've described. I said, if you're not leaning into it, then they always catch you from behind and you get knocked down. How does that look in real life? It looks like this. You're out somewhere because you haven't been leaning into it, and you hear a song on the radio. You smell a cologne or a perfume. You see a hat that your loved one used to wear, and immediately you overcome and fall into tears and collapse into grief. That wave just knocked you down. But leaning into it, I tell my patients, set aside some time, and I tell them 15 to 20 minutes is enough every day, at least once a day, where you will have private time alone. I prefer them to be by themselves, and you specifically sit down, put away the TV, put away the radio, and lean into, and specifically ask yourself, what's going on with you? What does it mean that your loved one's not here? How are you feeling about that? And if you actually saw a hat or smelled a cologne or whatever while you were out, then you say, you know what? I'm gonna remember that hat. I'm gonna play that song. I'm going to remember that cologne during my 20-minute time this evening when I get home. And I tell them to be alone because if it's so bad that they need to cry, I want them to feel free to cry. If it's so bad that they need to wail, it's okay to wail. If it's so bad they need to hit something, I tell them they can pound on their mattress. It's the only thing allowed to hit, pound on their mattress, okay? But lean into this. And at first, they might not do much processing. They might only do venting. But after a short time, they will begin to be able to process and think and work through. And you do this every day. And every patient I've told to do this, they'll do it every day. But then they'll, after a period of time, realize they only need to do it 3 days a week. And then eventually it's 1 day a week. And then eventually it's maybe once every 6 months. And then they don't really do it at all because they've healed. But it's a process of working it through and being honest and true. How has your life changed? What did they mean to you? And then they can start thinking of things. Well, is there anything they want to do to honor that person as they carry their life forward, that transition towards the future again?
Yes.
Okay, so this is the process. But now let's talk about the things that get in the way of people resolving the grief. There are things that actually people that prevent people from resolving the grief. Even if they're leaning into it, they still don't. They just stay in the waters of grief. They never seem to be able to work it out and get out of it. So what are the obstacles you've seen that actually have prevented people from getting out of the grief? And we're not talking they're just not even dealing with it. But we're talking people who are now dealing with it, but there's something in the way.
I mean, beliefs about death.
Okay.
Beliefs about what happens after death.
Okay, so yeah, that could be in the way. Maybe they're concerned their loved one isn't in heaven.
Yep, believing that they're in hell. That's a big one. Yeah.
And what have you seen?
Well, a lot of times, and I've seen this in the civilian, but and probably even more in the military, we end up having people that feel guilty about what happened. And so, like if they were in, a situation where combat or IED or even just a regular situation like a car wreck, if I hadn't have been, maybe if I'd have been a better driver, then we wouldn't have gotten that wreck and that person would not have died. Yeah. And that guilt can really keep them from healthily processing the event.
So that's exactly right.
Yes.
And is it an accurate guilt because they murdered the person, or is it a false guilt?
Yeah, it's false.
Okay, so this is important, this false guilt, and it's very common in grief, in which self gets blamed, and it happens for two reasons. One's neurobiological and one's psychological. The neurobiological reason is that when people are in some aspect of denial that we talked about, not fully being truthful about things, then they're not actually processing it in their critical reasoning part of their brain, which is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, where we actually do our critical reasoning. But the stress is still there, and so the brain, if we're in denial in some way, the brain will send that signal into the orbital cortex above the eye. And then the normal job of the orbital cortex, its normal function, is if you're doing something inappropriate or wrong, to give you a conviction of wrongdoing and to lead you away from that. Like if you were in church this weekend and try to stand up in the middle of service and strip all your clothes off in front of everyone, the orbital cortex would naturally and normally begin firing and give you a conviction of wrongdoing, make you very uncomfortable and guilt-ridden to not do it. So people who are not fully and honestly dealing with a loss, their neural circuits will actually process it in the orbital cortex, and they'll start actually getting convictions of wrongdoing, get negative ruminating loops going. Wow. So one is neurobiological reason. But that neurobiological reason is reinforced by a psychological reason. And the psychological reason also plays into the neurobiologic. It's a form of denial, not wanting to actually accept what's happening, wanting to reverse history, wanting to undo, or on some level, find a way to fix it.
Yeah.
And on an unconscious level, all of us know that the only person that we truly can change is ourself. We can't change others. And so if I want to make this go away, what can I do to fix it? Yep. And so they begin in their unconscious mind, which is reinforced by the neural circuits being out of balance because we don't really want to accept it. We're still trying to find a way to fix it. If I would have done this, if I would have done that, and that leads to this false guilt. And so how we resolve that is through our talk therapy, where we actually stop and engage them in what's called cognitive therapy, where we actually ask truthfully.
Yep.
And we actually compare their fantasy, if I'd have done this or I'd have done that, with reality. What they knew and what decisions and options they had before them. Did they actually take action to harm the person, et cetera, et cetera?
Yep, actually breaking down the specific
and
details.
that requires them to engage dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which reconnects salience network, and then replaces a false belief with a true one, and allows them then to work through. So that's so working through the false guilt with truth sets free, is an important part. So that is one obstacle, the false guilt. Other obstacles are the change in identity.
Yeah, you mentioned that.
So it's not false guilt, but it is, I don't like my life without this in it. Mm-hmm. I don't like my life without my child, without my spouse. I don't like the life without my house that we sold. I don't like my life without my leg that was amputated, or whatever it is they've lost. They want their old life back. They don't want this life. So while they've accepted the facts because they've got their, prosthetic device, or they've gone through the funeral and they've settled the estate, they accept the facts of it. In heart, this is not the life they want. So inside their own heart and mind, they're still living in the sense of, I want my old life back. I don't want this life.
Absolutely.
And so they don't resolve it. Yeah. And so one of the processes you have to help them with is the actual coming to terms and who they are and who their life is, and whether they're willing to accept the new life, the different life, the changed life, or whether they will continue to live while they get up each day and go through the motions of life. What I tell them is, you're going through the motions of life, but your heart is still in the past. Yep. Your heart is tied to the past. You haven't reinvested. And if they have children, and this I've seen this very commonly with parents who've had a child die, that they want the child back. And I get that. But what happens is they stay in this sense of dysphoria, not wanting to let go and say goodbye to the child. So they stay stuck in this constant grief, but they still have children at home, which means their heart is not invested to be the same thriving, vibrant parent for the children they have left. And I point this out to them. Don't your current children need you fully invested in today? Yep. And that actually is quite motivational and helpful. But at the end of the day, this is the conflict that many have of letting go. And so there's this process not only of looking forward, but actually saying goodbye.
Yes.
And this goodbye is quite different to the Christian and the non-Christian.
Yes.
And so we come to this aspect of how we deal with grief, which you were saying, where's my loved one in the hereafter, what happens at death? But to the Christian, the goodbye is goodbye until we meet again. To the non-Christian, it's goodbye, I'm never going to see you again, often.
Yep.
Either way, if they're going to actually move forward successfully, they've got to say goodbye and let go. Or else they emotionally and mentally live in the past, tied to the past, and they can't truly invest in moving forward. And in fact, if they try, if they're still tied to the past, something good happens and they find themselves actually enjoying it, they will immediately come under guilt. How can I enjoy this without my loved one here? And then they will feel bad and punish themselves for it. Have you seen that?
Yes.
Yeah. One of the things I think is easy to say, but it's hard to actually wrap our brain around sometimes. In Ecclesiastes, King Solomon, most scholars agree, wrote that. And if we believe what the Bible said, he was blessed with, extraordinary wisdom by God, that he says that there's a season for everything, a time for every activity under heaven. And I think that when we recognize that he goes through this laundry list of things, and you wisely mentioned at the beginning, I think that doesn't mean that just because we experience them in life that was God's original intention, because he gives some pretty, time for war, time for peace. I don't think God's original intention was for people to have war, a time to kill, those kinds of things. But he says that God has made everything beautiful in its own time. And if we can help them see from that, like you said, that Christian perspective, that there was a season or that person, that part of our life, that time where I was a young parent and I had children, but now they've grown up and left the house. I mean, it still is beautiful, even if I'm not there anymore. And I think that that's a huge dynamic in the Christian perspective that helps us bid goodbye to that season to fully embrace the next one. And it doesn't make it necessarily less painful.
So with what you're saying, I think I hear you suggesting, but don't let me put words in your mouth, that one of the obstacles for some people's grief is they don't trust God.
Yes.
They're not actually trusting God with what happened. They may be holding to some fantasies.
Yep.
Life would have been better if this didn't happen. My life would have been better. God didn't care enough to protect my loved one. Are these ideas that can come in? Rather than the view of, I know God is not the source of death. He's not the source of suffering and harm. But, my life and my family is in God's hands. And I don't know all the pros and cons, the future, all the variables. But I know that, as Job said, even if God were the one to kill me, yet I would trust him.
That's right.
That I trust him with some way, something good will come out of this. Because the Bible says all things work together for good for them that love the Lord. It doesn't say all things are good. And I don't believe, God is the cause of all of these things, but I trust him to bring good out of it. Are you saying that sometimes people don't resolve their grief because they hold to a belief that it would have been better for their life if they hadn't lost whatever it was they lost, whether it was a family member, whether it was a leg, whether it was a job, whether it was a house, that it would have been better had they not lost it for their life.
Right.
Rather than, so rather than me give the answer here, what do you counsel? What do either one of you counsel? Well, a patient's got that view, my life would be better if this didn't happen. And they're Christian and they believe in God. And your discernment is they're not just grieving, but they've got this view that basically says, I don't trust God with how it's going to turn out.
Yep.
It would have been better. They have this. It would have been better had it not happened. My life would be better. I have a better future had it not happened. Mm-hmm. How do you deal with that? How do you help them with that?
Well, there's a difference between better and different. It's like, yeah, your life would probably be different if this hadn't happened, but you can't know that it would have been better.
So you're telling me I'm better off without my loved one?
No, saying it's different, but we don't know the future. But what God promises is restoration, whether it be in heaven or here, it's spiritual restoration. It's relationship with God and working things out for good. But it's
Well, if he didn't protect my mother from getting killed in a car wreck, how can I trust him to protect the other things that are important to me?
chaplain.
Well, you know,
I say talk to your pastor.
It is, and this is a great chance for us to bridge the balance between feelings and reality. I mean, feelings tell us great things. Feelings give us great information. I like to say they're wonderful gauges, but they're terrible guides. That we have to balance feelings with reality to lead us to truth. So the feeling of grief is, yes, you're hurting. Yes, this is painful. Yes, you've lost something. But the reality is God can work through all of this brokenness and use all of these struggles to grow our strength. That, you know, when Joseph stood in front of the very people who sold him into slavery and turned his life upside down for 13 years of being a slave and being a prisoner, he said, you meant this for evil. That's reality. But God meant this for good, which was also reality. And he adds to it, said that God used all of this to save your lives and the lives of many others. That God worked through all of those things, like we said, to bring good. Not that everything is good, but that he works through it to make it good in the end. And one of the things that I think is a easy to say, hard to balance with feelings is that if we believe in a God that can raise the dead, you know, when Lazarus was dead, and of course we have the benefit of knowing Lazarus was going to be resurrected, but when Jesus shows up, it's interesting to me that both sisters make the same statement. And I'm tempted to believe it was a little bit of collusion on their part, because they say it in two different times, that both of them come to Jesus and say, Lord, if only you had been here, my brother would not have died. And that's a true statement. Jesus could have been there, and we know the grand scheme of things. But the interesting thing is that if you were to go to what many historians believe is the tomb of Lazarus, his second death, it says, here is Lazarus twice dead, friend of Jesus. That there's this bigger picture involved that we can have that hope in. And so it's balancing those feelings with reality to help us admit, yes, you're feeling bad. Yes, there's brokenness and sadness, but God is going to work through all of this.
But the question is, as they're working through it, for those, not everybody has this struggle.
Right.
But for some have the view, again, that their life would be better had they not had the loss. It might be the loss of a loved one.
Right.
It might be the loss of a leg. It might be the loss of a house or a job. But whatever the loss is, the view is their life would be better, and they don't like this life. And so, you know, for me, there's an element here of, I think, a narrow vision, not a big vision, not seeing things from the perspective of heaven, or it may be an outgrowth of the God that they were taught to believe in.
That's right.
They might be, have been taught a God who is the source of pain, suffering, and punishment, and they view this as God having punished. And occasionally it happens. I got this because I was doing something bad, and God punished me.
Sure, Lord, who sinned that this man was born blind? Right?
Yes, exactly. And so these ideas can be obstacles to people resolving grief if they have distortions about God and his role in the process.
And that's what I thank you for bringing it back, because that's what I meant to go to when I said balancing feelings with reality. It's a great opportunity for us to present the real God, not maybe a God that they had been taught or their understanding of Scripture. So that's the reality we can also present by looking at, like you said, those design
So God's
laws.
role in the pain, where is that? What would you tell somebody?
God's role is in the healing.
Okay. So
Restoration.
so does God want anyone to feel pain and suffer?
No.
No,
Is God the source of pain, suffering, and death?
no.
No, in fact, the Bible says that Christ took upon himself human flesh, they might destroy him, holds the power of death, that is the devil. And the last enemy to be destroyed in 1 Corinthians 15 is death. And Christ destroyed death and brought life and immortality to light, 2 Timothy 1:10. So God is the source of life, health, and so pain, suffering, and death does not come out from God, but it's commonly taught that it does. And so you're exactly right. This conversation needs to be had. I mean, have you had thoughts that God was the one doing this? that God was maybe punishing in some way? I've had patients sometimes think this. Yes, they're often afraid to even say it out loud.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, it's been in my mind that maybe, and then you might hear some story they have in their mind. You have to unpack that, because if they're holding that inside their head, they will not resolve. They will live in fear,
Yep.
and they will not actually have true peace. Yeah. And
Yes.
so that is an obstacle. What is their view of God? And then, can they trust God with the future moving forward?
That's right.
Yeah.
Is he good?
How all things work together for good. Again, not all things are good. This wasn't good that this happened.
Mm-hmm.
But can God bring good out of it?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
But I will say sometimes, now let's maybe wind this around to where I push something off at the beginning, the circumcision of the heart by the Holy Spirit. I will say sometimes, what I just said, sometimes what happened is not good, and we grieve it, but God can bring good out of it. But sometimes the loss is good.
Yes.
Sometimes people are in a very dysfunctional relationship with an abusive spouse, and they will not get healthy in that dysfunctional relationship. And the only way of health, they have to get out of that relationship. But they're attached to that relationship, that person. And that relationship comes to an end in some form or fashion, whether it's just breakup or whether it's a death. And that person who was being abused and mistreated in a dysfunctional relationship will grieve.
Yes.
But that ending of that relationship, let's say it was not a death, but it was just they moved on to somebody else, that is actually good for that person.
Yes.
There was no health in that dysfunction.
Oh, absolutely. I had a patient that I worked with years ago that was actually her romantic partner was her supplier of her substances. And so as long as she was connected in that relationship, he was keeping her entwined in a substance abuse lifestyle.
So what is it? This is important for our patients listening, because I'm going to tell you there's going to be a bunch, our patients, our audience listening, because I'm going to tell you there's going to be a bunch of people out there who need what we're about to say. And that is, what is it the person and that dysfunctional relationship that we just talked about, this also will apply to addicts, by the way, and their addiction. What is it they're actually grieving? It's not the actual person. Because if they saw the person for who they are, they would rejoice in being free of them. Mm-hmm. They're grieving the fantasy they hold in their heart, the dream, the wish, the projection that they created. My one and only, the person who loved me, and they grieve the loss of the imagined or falsely created person that the abusive person was occupying in their internal world. They are not actually grieving the loss of the person for who and what they are in fact, in truth. And I can say this to them, and I point this out, I'll say, well, let's say you've been with this person for 15 years, and how old were you when you got together? We got together at 21, and this person has had an addiction problem and has mistreated you and beat you frequently and talked about, yes, but I miss them so much, blah, blah, blah. I said, if we could go back to high school, when you were in high school and I met you and you were 16, and I said to you, tell me about the man that you're hoping to marry one day and spend your life with. Would you say, I'm looking for an alcoholic who beats me and mistreats me? Would you have told me that? No. Then why are you longing for one now? And the light goes on. See, this person who they actually turned out to be was not the dream, the wish, the hope, but they kept the dream and wish and hope alive for their Prince Charming, and they allowed this person to occupy that space. And what they're losing, what they're grieving, they're actually feeling like, I've lost my Prince Charming. Yes. They were never that. Wake up.
And another part of it is people believe that's the best that they're going to get. And that's where there's a difference between life was better before versus life was different before. And people not only have to realize the reality of the situation, but they also have to believe their value in God's eyes so that they can see what kind of relationship God wants to give to them, not necessarily through a person, but even through a relationship with God, and see the life that they can have moving forward.
I love what you just said, because what you just did is you prioritized. Our first and number one duty is to love the Lord with all our heart, mind, soul, and strength. Yeah. Second is love neighbor as self. Mm-hmm. What you described are individuals who have vacuous means empty, sense of self.
Yep.
They have insecurities and fears. They see self in ways that are with little value. They don't see themselves as children of God, princes and princesses of God who came to deliver them. They don't see themselves in that light. And thus, they look for some other human validating agent, some person to show interest in them, some person to cherish them or value them in order for them to find internal wholeness or sense of meaning or purpose from the other person's attentions and affections and interests, which is not love, it's codependency, and it's fear-driven and insecurity-driven, and it always results in dysfunctional relationships and when the person's exploited. And so what you're describing is to truly grieve then, they have to not only grieve the loss of this person who was mistreating them, they actually have to come to the truth of who they are in God's kingdom and establish a healthy internal sense of self based on reality of who they are in relation with God first. And only then can they move forward and find a healthy relationship. If they don't do that, they'll just recycle the relationships of dysfunction over and over again.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah?
Absolutely.
Any other thoughts or comments we want to share about grief today? So I've got a couple things more to say. If you're grieving, one of the things you need to know is that once there is woundedness or brokenness, there is no pain-free options. Mm-hmm. You only have the option to heal or not heal. And if you think about a physical wound for a moment, and I tell my patients, just think about a physical wound. Let's say somebody gassed your leg. This is a metaphor for something you've lost. You've had the event happen. Somebody's gassed your leg. Once the wound is there, can you reverse history and undo it? Once your loved one has died, you can't reverse history and undo it. So you only have three options. Deal with it as effectively as you can, as quickly as possible. Bring healing, disinfectant, sutures, antibiotics. Let's get the wound healed. That's option one. Option two, ignore it. Fine. It'll be great. Just leave it alone. Option three, actively infect it. Rub some manure in it. With emotional wounds, it's the same.
Yep.
Once you've had the wound, there are only three options. Deal with it as effectively as you can to bring healing as quickly as possible. Ignore it. I'm fine. It's not that big a deal. I'll be okay. Or actively infect it. When it comes to physical wounds, almost everybody picks option one. When it comes to emotional wounds, almost everybody picks option 2 and 3. Yeah. And how you infect an emotional wound is with lies and distortions. It's my fault, the false guilt, not letting go, creating fantasies about who that person was, whether in reality of seeing them for who they really were. You infect it with falsehoods and lies, and that makes it worse. So this is what I teach my patients, and then we start the process of, hey, you're ready to heal. Let's deal with it as effectively as you can. You got to lean into it.
Yep.
You got to be truthful. You got to begin processing. And of course, I always tell them in relationship with Jesus Christ.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Take your broken heart to the Lord and ask Him to help put the pieces together and help yourself find your true identity in Him. And a lot of times the grief is because they lost somebody who was helping them form their sense of self, and they don't know who they are anymore without that person.
Yep.
And that's where they need to find their true self in Jesus.
That's right.
Well, thank you for joining us today. If you have questions, send those in to questions@designformore.net, questions@designformore.net, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you for joining us on Designed for More, brought to you by Come and Reason Ministries and Honey Lake Clinic. Also, don't forget to check out our other podcasts for more inspiring content.